I want to shift our focus for a few minutes a little to the imagined practice of democracy, our hopes for democracy. Because in many countries, the practice of democracy has been eroded for decades by cultural and organisational processes that once perhaps seemed supportive of democratic expression, but which have damaged its very basis. And the result is what in my 2010 book, Why Voice Matters, I call the crisis of voice in neoliberal democracies. To survive this crisis and build a democratic culture after neoliberalism will require clear-sightedness as to the conditions for new voices to be sustained, overcoming the paradoxical state of voice blindness that characterises the present. How we might start to do this is the main topic of my talk. Let me start with the problem, the multi-level crisis of voice in neoliberal democracies. By neoliberal democracies, I mean simply states with the formal properties of democracies that have variously been dominated for decades by neoliberal doctrine. By a crisis of voice, I mean a situation where in many domains, voice is continually offered yet retracted, endorsed but then made empty. The contradictions of late modern democratic politics are multiple and complex, of course. I don't mean to understate that complexity, but I want to insist as one element in the mix on the specific intent of neoliberal doctrine for over 3 decades to make market functioning the overriding principle of social and political organisation. The core of neoliberal doctrine was stated most clearly by Michel Foucault in his lectures that I'm sure you know called The Birth of Biopolitics, where he identifies an early and deep rethinking of liberal governmentality that does not ask the state what freedom it will leave to the economy, but asks the economy how its freedom can have a state-creating function. Here are the seeds of the idea now so familiar that markets themselves provide a principle of social organisation and so a preferred model for transforming politics itself. Neoliberal discourse is an attack not just on particular conditions of political speech or voice in the familiar sense, but an attack on the very idea that the opinions, desires and goals of human beings might matter in the organisation of common resources, an attack on voice as a value. Neoliberalism installs the intellectual imperialism of a certain type of economic thought that, as Wendy Brown puts it, while foregrounding the market, is not only or even primarily focused on the economy, rather it involves extending and disseminating market values to all institutions and social action. What more precisely do I mean by voice? Well, I mean the process, first of all, whereby people give an account of the world within which they act. This process is reflexive, and I do use that word non-ironically. Reflexive, it's embodied, it requires a material form, which may be, of course, individual, collective, distributed. I also mean, second, voice as a value. The process of voice relies on socially produced resources. It's oriented to social exchange, and that's why voice can be undermined by an organisational rationality which does not value voice, so crowding out alternative narratives that would authorise us to value voice. Neoliberalism is just such a voice-denying rationality. It operates with an account of the social as a space for expanding freedom modelled only on economic competition that lacks most of the features associated with social life. And if it's ever to be resisted, neoliberal rationality must be opposed by what Wendy Brown calls a counter-rationality, a different figuration of human beings' citizenship, economic life, and the political. But you might say, well, things are much more complicated than that. And of course they are. The current crisis of democracy, for example, in Europe, is much more than a cultural construction. It's a profoundly practical crisis, a crisis of economic and political management. Neoliberalism's slogans that markets are always right has been fundamentally undermined ever since the financial collapse of autumn 2008. And yet the crisis of democratic functioning continues, deepening to a point where whatever voter majorities say, the same sorts of measures are imposed because global markets and economic reality demand it. Today's crisis of voice, then, is shaped not just by neoliberal doctrine and what I call neoliberal culture, but by the independent practical reality that national governments' means to manage their national economies have been drastically reduced during 3 decades of expanding global financial markets. This will already be very familiar to this audience, so let me be very brief on that point. Just consider following Colin Lee's works in his book Market-Driven Politics. His work, the point about the huge increase in national economies' dependence on foreign direct investment. Using 2010 UNCTAD figures, if we look at inward direct foreign investment as a percentage of GDP, this grew in the UK from 1997 to 2010 from 19% to 48%. Similarly, sharp rises are found in many other countries. As a result, it is factually incontrovertible that national governments face increasing real pressures to adopt policies that are favourable to global markets. What we call the economy, nationally, regionally, globally, seems beyond democratic control. Philip Bobbitt, the theorist of the market state, describes the nation-state's attempts to control global markets as like those of a bear chained to a stake, trying to chase a shifting beam of light. During the still unresolved euro crisis, intergovernmental meetings, I think, have become like a sad circus of trapped animals, gesturing at democratic freedom, but with little effect. Even more disturbingly, we have become accustomed to the idea that democracy does not work. On many levels, we all work, as we'll recall in the next panel, in institutions dominated by what the UK financial sociologist Michael Power long ago called audit culture. Whatever its apparently democratic motivation, he writes that the audit process is never democratic. It requires trust in experts and is not a basis for rational public deliberation. It's a dead end in the claim of accountability. Audit is in this respect a substitute for democracy rather than its aid. Indeed, celebratory theorists of the market state, like Bobbitt, may be more alive to its contradictions than conventional political commentary. Writing in 2003, Bobbitt described how national governments' priorities would shift from maximising the welfare of citizens to maximising populations' opportunities for participating in global markets. But he realised that the offer of participation in government can never be completely abandoned if the market state is to retain any legitimacy. Instead, he suggests that that offer must become contradictory. There will be more public participation in government, but it will count for less. And there's a deeper contradiction that he notes. For the legitimacy of the market state has its roots, as he realises, in the public goods necessary for any quality of life. Goods that, as Bobbitt admits, the market, quotes, is not well adapted to creating or maintaining. What are these public goods? Loyalty, civility, trust in authority, respect for family life. So this is the underlying paradox of neoliberal politics and culture, that neoliberal doctrine requires social goods that its market principles disavow and in practice undermine. Today's crisis therefore involves a genuine impasse, namely how to manage economic life democratically at all, on any level. This impasse in the democratic management of all economies has much in common with deeper historical problems, however, that have long afflicted the modern concept of democracy. Here, French political theorist Pierre Rosanvallon, his recent book Political Legitimacy, is quite helpful. If one way of reading today's crisis of democratic management is as a conflict, as he puts it, between the time of the global markets, which can move within minutes or even seconds against a national economy through the yields demanded on its government's bond offerings, to put it at its simplest, the time of the global markets on the one hand versus the time of democratic decision-making, which can never be synchronised with the changing demands of markets. If then the democratic crisis within the euro crisis is such a conflict between different temporalities, then Rosanvallon notes we can find an analogous contradiction in the early discussions on democracy that followed the French Revolution. It was the Marquis de Condorcet, he points out, who realised in 1790 that popular deliberation in a democracy requires a reflective context whose time must always extend beyond the moment of an election, or even the moment when an elected government has to make a difficult decision. As a result, democracy inevitably involves multiple temporalities, and the role of popular will for Condorcet was somehow to connect up those temporalities into something more coherent. And this is the key point. How can this now happen? It's only this way, Rosanvallon argues, that we can restore what he calls legitimacy of reflexivity. And here he notes that civil society organisations make a vital contribution. How? By, as he puts it, reintroducing the people as principle into the political arena. We can understand the Occupy movement and its attempt to interrupt the policy process, I think, in precisely this way. But Rosanvallon sees a further problem of legitimacy that he calls the legitimacy of proximity. That is, the conflict between the distance from everyday life, necessary if complex societies are to be governed at all, and the proximity to everyday experience, necessary if government is to have any legitimacy over the longer term. Rulers must, within this new model, be present to the people in some sense. And of course, contemporary media provide practical ways for politicians to be present to the people and for the experiences of particular people to be presented to government. But there's a risk of this media interface collapsing into an empty spectacle that actually obstructs decision-making. In response, Rosanvallon argues, we need new forms of democratic experimentation that allow citizens to become involved in government through new types of engagement that would enable a better, quote, exchange of information between government and society. I try and say that without irony after Claire's wonderful talk, but it's impossible to hope for such things, I think. The static notion of the general will in earlier democratic theory, therefore, needs to be refreshed by what he calls, interestingly, a constant generalisation of the social, but of course without collapsing into a pure localism. And this takes me to the second part of my talk, which is about how we as citizens, rather than necessarily academics, might respond to the difficult challenges that face the practice of democracy today. And here I have just 3 points. The first is on the importance of saying no. The second is on the importance of saying yes. And the third is on the importance of distinguishing false arenas of democratisation from more promising ones. Future democratic experimentation simply can't succeed unless it's prepared to say no to the forces that negate democracy. Saying no does not require an act of violence. Its negation can operate at the level of discourse. In Jose Saramago's wonderful novel Seeing, which you may know, which was published 1 year after the notoriously undemocratic decision to go to war in Iraq, saying no takes the form of submitting an election voting paper that is blank. And yet this simple rejection of what is on democratic offer works, especially if, as in the novel, it's repeated a second time. It works as if it were an act of symbolic violence against the principle of so-called democratic government. In the novel, however, it's interpreted as an act of physical violence by a government that is completely blind to this new way of democratic seeing. As a leader of a local council says in the novel to a minister of the interior, whether you like it or not, minister, it's night now, pitch black night. We know that something is happening that goes far beyond our understanding, that exceeds our meagre experience, but we're behaving as if it's the same old bread, made with the usual flour and cooked in the usual oven. What more specifically must we say no to in today's crisis of voice? At least 2 separate things. First, the idea so often insisted upon by governments that market values and the overall necessity of market functioning can and always should override other important values such as voice and democratic functioning. Even Elizabeth, the daughter of Rupert Murdoch, argued in her speech to the Royal Television Society last August that we should reject the idea, quotes, that the free market is the only sorting mechanism for organising public life. More substantially, Harvard philosopher Michael Sandel argues in his recent book, What Money Can't Buy, that market reasoning empties public life of moral argument and that when, quotes, the logic of buying and seeing governs increasingly the whole of life, it's time to ask whether we want to live this way. Sandow, however, is weaker on the political causes of the moral blind spots that he identifies. He condemns the general, quotes, moral vacancy of contemporary politics, as if all of us were somehow equally to blame for the principle that markets override other public values. Well, we also need to say so to something else, which is to those specific forms of politics, not always explicitly neoliberal, and I'm thinking of Tony Blair, politics that refuse to say no to markets, that indeed are based on translating markets' supposed necessity into political and cultural reality. A paradox of the neoliberal state, not just in Britain, has been that to ensure market spreads, and we dealt with this morning, governments must interfere massively in the regulation of social and economic life. Again, I don't need to say much to this audience about this process, except to note that the spread of audit culture and various forms of market infrastructure effectively enclose, for private gain, decision-making processes that should be and were once accountable to public values. New types of expertise gain power, for example, the vast consultancy industry that serves health provision, obscuring the fact that they operate in what was once a zone for public deliberation and remains largely subsidised by public money through taxation. As in the economy generally, we have to get better at saying no to the authority of economic commentators, spokespersons of corporate power, their authority to dominate debate on the economy and the management of our scarce resources. It's not a question of rejecting genuine expertise, of course, but of rejecting the illegitimate claims of certain types of experts to control public decisions on the distribution of common goods. Which takes me to my next point, that any strategy of saying no to be effective must be based in alternative possibilities of saying yes to new ways of organising resources, decision-making, democratic representation. To quote Elizabeth Murdoch again, profit without purpose is a recipe for disaster. But what sort of purpose? Whose purpose? Generating these alternatives is now, and always has been, perhaps very difficult, yet they're essential to escaping today's impasse of democratic government. Longer-term alternatives require us to grasp, to say yes to, useful democratic experiment wherever it occurs. Now, as I noted before, the Occupy movement can be read as an attempt to form Rousseau's concept of the general will in new ways. As such, it was a fundamental contribution to the contemporary crisis of democracy. The Occupy movement interrupted the bleak routine of what Razon-Vallon calls counter-democracy by operating on at least two levels. First, it said yes to the possibility of thinking differently about the political consequences of global markets. Occupy stepped around the supposed necessity of what the markets say and asserted a more basic truth, that the economy, on whatever scale, remains the way that human beings organise common resources for a better life. Amartya Sen insisted 25 years ago in his book on ethics and economics that we must restore economics to the domain of the political and the ethical. But until recently, this aspect of his work has had little influence outside academic circles because to do so will require rethinking ourselves as political subjects, as political actors. That is, saying yes to our possible role in deciding how the economy should be. Nothing perhaps could be harder than this. That is, trying to see the economy once more as a site of decision, as a process that must somehow be opened up to democratic accountability. This requires new acts of citizenship, in Engin Aysin's term, new habits of treating ourselves and those around us as citizens with a valid contribution to make on how the economy should be run, which is where the Occupy movement and its improvised educational resources were, like the educational experiments a few years before the Transition Town movement, important ways, and this is the second level on which Occupy operated, of generalising the social, as Razon-Vallon puts it, bringing a different range of people into the processes through which we enact a social that can represent us. But such experiments are not enough unless they are recognised by government and by a significant body of citizens not directly involved. If most governments and most citizens remain blind to these processes of democratic voice and their political meaning, then they won't get very far. And that's the risk from us remaining voice blind. Blind, that is, to the wider conditions needed to sustain new and effective forms of voice. Which takes me to my final point, that in developing such experiments, in forming the general will, we must not be misled by false offers of collectivity. And here I think there's a lot of common ground between my work and Jodie Dean's work over a number of years on this point. Nearly 4 decades ago, the geographer Henri Lefebvre wrote in the Production of Space of the illusion of transparency that capitalist spaces of exchange create. If we keep our eyes and ears fixed only within those spaces, he writes, real life, as he puts it, appears quite close to us, but is not really close. And this warning is a good antidote to much of the rhetoric that surrounds today's social media platforms. Those platforms' importance in everyday habit and their role as a context for some historical moments of mobilization is not in doubt. But what is the long-term price that these platforms demand in return for the sense of immediacy, collective immediacy that they provide? Social media platforms are organized to one primary end, as we all know, to the ever more precise and continuous tracking of individual actions and choices to generate income for data collectors, content providers, platform owners, and of course advertisers. As the most perceptive analyst of the revolution underway in the digital public world, Joseph Thoreau notes, the centrality of corporate power is a direct reality at the very heart of the digital age. So we need to be very careful before we rush into claiming that in this or that place online, the people are gathered, whether or not government is directly involved in the modes of citizen engagement. It may or may not be, but we need to be equally concerned. For the lateral social network, the collective voicing of, in Lefebvre's phrase, real life close to us, has itself become the main focus of value production in today's emerging media industries, leading to what elsewhere I have called the myth of us, the myth of a natural pre-existing collectivity that somehow is magically gathered on the very platforms whose economic model is based on selling the fact of that collectivity with all its accompanying data. All this, therefore, complicates today's experiments with democratic form that have no choice but to use social media platforms in some way, and it's not a matter, of course, of ignoring everyday forms of online sociality, retreating into some realm of pure thought in the book-line study. It's a matter of judging clear-sightedly such platforms and such possibilities for whether they actually contribute to the long-term development of new democratic forms. And for this to conclude, I suggest two guides are especially useful. The first is the value of voice that I've been arguing throughout today's talk and in my book, which has begun tentatively, I think, to find expression in the economic and development policy field, for example, through the work of Amartya Sen and others, although much more work needs to be done. And I have to admit that Tony Blair was one of the people who sponsored this interesting report, so that may discount it in your view, but it's worth reading in any event. And the second inspirational guide, I think, remain the fables of the late Jose Saramago. It's not governments, but all citizens, Saramago suggests, who need to see clearly before them the new possibilities of voice now emerging and the tough preconditions if those possibilities are to be sustained. And this shift in our current ways of seeing and not seeing is difficult. We may hear voices of protest all around us, but remain voice blind, blind to the conditions of and potentials for a wider and more sustained transformation. The challenge then, as expressed by Saramago, is to end this blindness and to see right in front of us the ground both of our despair and of our new experiments of hope. Thanks for listening.